With Iran having weaponized its geography as it pertains to the Strait of Hormuz and the war against it well into its second month, there are no discernible signs of an early end to the conflagration. The Gulf states, led by Bahrain, have asked the United Nations Security Council to authorize military action against Iran over Hormuz, but its outcome remains uncertain, as China, Russia, and France, three of the Council's five permanent members, opposing it. To understand broader implications, MCR spoke to John Bolton, a former national security advisor to President Donald Trump in his first term and a former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. John Bolton. Welcome to my Inchai Report, Mr. Bolton. It's a pleasure to have you.
Glad to be back with you. Thanks for having me.
Iran has weaponized its geography as it pertains to the Strait of Hormuz. Going into the war, did Washington either underestimate or misread that Tehran would do that?
Well, you're asking for a mind-reading effort of Donald Trump, which is never easy. The reality of the geography around the Gulf has obviously been there a long time, and I think it's fair to say that everybody for decades has minimized the potential implication of Iran or anybody else trying to use the Strait of Hormuz to shut off oil shipments out of the Gulf. There are probably a lot of reasons for that, but many assumptions were built around the idea that transit through the strait would not be compromised. And obviously, we're not going to make that mistake in the future. But it's also the case that people did see that potential. And I can say in the first term, when I recommended to Trump, and as did others, that we pursue a policy of regime change in Iran, we talked about many aspects of what would be involved. And the obvious way that Iran could respond in addition to its conventional defenses was through asymmetric warfare, cyber warfare, terrorism, or closing the Strait of Hormuz. I wasn't in the room this time when the Pentagon briefed the president and other senior advisors on what might lie ahead, but I would bet an unlimited amount of money that they told him very clearly that the strait was vulnerable, and that indeed Iran might also attack Gulf Arab countries, even if they weren't engaged in the joint U.S.-Israel operation. The Pentagon specializes in plans and contingencies since the days of George Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower. They recognize that advanced planning, while it wouldn't answer all the questions and while the plan might never come anywhere close to fruition, it was the exercise of planning and thinking about how to deal with contingencies that gave us an edge. So the Pentagon has long known what the risks were. And I think it's still unexplained how Trump could have missed it. He has said in the course of the hostilities that he was surprised that the Iranians were attacking the Gulf Arabs and surprised that they had closed the strait. It's impossible to believe that he wasn't told. So why he's surprised, I can't say. But I do think it reflects a lack of his own strategic thinking. He doesn't play three-dimensional chess like many of his supporters say. He plays it barely one move at a time. And I think what we're seeing in the Gulf now, in many respects, obviously, particularly the closure of the strait, is that reality at work.
Having tasted its power over Hormuz, do you think Iran will now give it up, the strait as leverage ever?
No. I think what's happened is that the Iranian regime has made very palpable that in addition to its nuclear weapons threat and its threat of international terrorism, whether through the likes of Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis, or whether its own direct terrorist action in Europe or North America, it has a third capability, namely to prevent maritime traffic in the Gulf that it doesn't consent to allow to proceed. And to me, this is simply a revelation of just how determined this regime is to retain power. And one more piece of evidence why its behavior is never going to change. And the only way to protect ourselves from its multiple threats, now including to the world economy, is to remove the regime.
In this context, how do you view a move by Arab countries led by Bahrain to get the United Nations Security Council to authorize military action against Iran to reopen the strait?
Well, it may be helpful. As I understand the state of play with the resolution now, which may not be voted on until Saturday, it's been weakened from what Bahrain originally proposed, and now essentially authorizes only defensive steps. I mean, honestly, I think that means that the Gulf states could take military action. They've been attacked by Iran, and their ability to get their oil into international commerce gravely restricted. So in that sense, it may still be worthwhile. I think the reaction of the Gulf states has been very interesting. They were shocked that Iran actually began targeting them after the war began, and the shock pretty soon turned to outrage. So now we have press reports that Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is urging Trump to finish the job, basically, and remove the regime in Iran. The Emiratis reportedly are moving toward active military involvement. This is something that could have been anticipated had Trump consulted with the Gulf Arabs before starting the war, or a lot of other people as well. But to the extent the Arabs have now sized up the situation, they obviously believe if the regime is not removed, it will give Iran a permanent hegemony over transit through the Gulf and the Strait, which for them, I think, is unacceptable.
But don't you think even if the current leadership is fully dismantled and Iran returns to some measure of what the West defines as democracy, they would still recognize Hormuz as great leverage for any future pressures?
Well, in fact, it's great leverage for anybody that wants to put pressure on another Gulf country. I mean, it's great leverage for Saudi Arabia too if they decided to close the strait. If you go back to pre-1979 world scenario, the Shah and the Gulf Arabs were competitors in the international oil market, although in the 1970s they became part of the same OPEC cartel that raised oil prices dramatically. But what they were able to do was through competition or through collusion to raise prices, they worked the issue economically. And there was never a threat that I'm aware of from the Shah or any of the Gulf Arab states to actually close the strait, because they knew how much they all depended on it. And I would think with anything like what I would call a normal regime in Iran, whether it be a democracy or whether it be a military government, at least not one following this radical theological ideology that rules in Iran today, that you would have disputes about transit and this and that and the other, but they would all be worked out diplomatically. We wouldn't see the use of military force to close the strait by any regime that one would consider normal.
I want to ask a broader question, which hardly, if at all, gets discussed here. Successive American presidents and administrations have glaringly, in my view, failed to recognize and understand two defining factors while invading countries in Asia, especially. One is, of course, high tolerance for pain in those societies, and the other is deep civilizational pride like Iran has millennially. We see that on display right now in Iran. Why do you think the US does not get that simple fact that these are civilizationally very proud people?
Well, I think they are. I think that's one reason why there's so much discontent inside Iran today with the regime. And I think it's widespread across the country. The problem the opposition has is it's not well organized. And that was something that Trump also has left out of his planning, as far as I can tell. He's not coordinated with opponents of the regime. He's not provided them with material assistance, telecommunications, money, weapons if they want it. Because they will have to do a lot of the heavy lifting in getting regime change. But I think it's important to lay out what the discontents are inside Iran, because they're very profound, and I think put the regime in the most difficult position it's been in since it took power in 1979. Number one, the economy's a mess, and made more of a mess by the misguided irrigation policies they've proceeded to follow since the original revolution that really is causing a water shortage all over Iran. So widespread economic discontent, all regions, all classes. Second, the young people who constitute two-thirds of the population, two-thirds of the population is under 30, know they could have a different life than they have under the theology. They can see it across the Gulf. They see it on the internet when they're allowed to use it. And they're very restive about their futures under this regime. The women, ever since over 3 years ago now, the murder of Mahsa Amini, the young Kurdish woman who was killed for defying the Ayatollah's dress code, it very, very widespread. And we saw that in the demonstrations that resulted 3 years ago. This is also a direct attack on the legitimacy of the Ayatollah's claim to speak the word of God, because if they don't speak the word of God on the dress code for women, they don't speak it on anything. And I think everybody understands why this is a fundamental challenge. And then finally, on top of this, you've got the ethnic tensions. Depending on whose census you believe, Persians are 50 or 60% of the population. You've got 10% are Kurds, maybe 30%, maybe more, that are Azeris. You've got Arabs, Baluchis. You've got a lot of very discontented ethnic groups. You put all this together, and I think the regime is in a very weak state. So what the proper regime change approach would have been is go after the instruments of Iranian state power, specifically the Revolutionary Guard, that threaten its neighbors and others overseas, and that threaten its own citizens. So the Quds Force for overseas threats and the Basij militia for domestic threats. And that's what's happening. And I think that is cracking the regime at the top. We've produced a premature succession crisis by eliminating the supreme leader and hundreds of others in the military and civilian life. It's certainly true the government is still in place, but you can see the fractures beginning to develop. That's where the opponents inside Iran play a critical role in being able to say what I think is true. The regime can't defend itself. And if the regime can't defend itself, it can't long stay in power. That's what convinces people inside the regime who say the ship is going down, we don't want to go down with it, to come over to the opposition.
But everything that you described adds up to an ecosystem which is ripe for a sort of a popular uprising, and yet it hasn't happened, partly because of the mortal dangers that people face coming out onto the streets, but more importantly, in my judgment, I think the Iranians also see that this war is fundamentally upending their society, and that's not acceptable to them. Don't you think that's the case?
Well, I think the targeting thus far, which has been almost entirely military, there have been some tragic accidents, but the intent of the attacks has been to weaken the capabilities of the regime, as I say, both externally and domestically. And I do think that has overwhelming support among the Iranian people. Part of the problem, though, is we're not making that case inside Iran, having dismantled much of the Agency for Global Media's capabilities. Some of it's come back, but we've lost a lot of that. And we're not taking advantage of the enormous Iranian diaspora. In the U.S., we have many Iranian Americans. We have many Iranians there on refugee status. The same is true in Europe. These are people who know the country well. Their families are still there. They have friends. Many have been back until fairly recently. It's a very powerful weapon for gaining information about what's going on inside Iran and causing trouble for the regime that I don't think we're using.
How do you see the either competing or even conflicting objectives between the U.S. and Israel on Iran? How is that playing out?
I think, without question, Israel's explicit objective is regime change. This has been Netanyahu's view for 30 years, if not more. And they have been systematically going after the leadership and other targets. At the same time, they've been going after Iran's chief terrorist proxy, Hezbollah, in Lebanon, that was not destroyed after the Hamas attacks of October of 2023. And the Israelis are clearly trying to reduce Hezbollah's power still further. Nobody knows what Trump's objective is, including Trump, probably. I thought he was starting out on a regime change operation. You may recall back in January when the demonstrations were underway, Trump posted on social media a statement saying, keep protesting, take control of your institutions. Those were his words. Help is on its way. And when he announced the attacks on March the 1st at 2:30 in the morning, our time, he said to the Iranian people, this is your chance. You may not get it again in generations. Now, what he's been doing since then, what his objectives are anybody's guess. And I think right now he's close to panic that the economic consequences that have been caused by Iran's closing the strait are having a negative impact on him domestically in the U.S. and that politically could have a significant negative effect in the November congressional elections, which is why I think he's been building the case to say, okay, we've won, time to get out. I have achieved regime change, he says, although he hasn't. And he has destroyed the nuclear program, he says, although we haven't. We've done substantial damage. But the problem is if a wounded regime survives, it will rebuild the nuclear program, rebuild the terrorist threats. It will never forget the impact of closing the Strait of Hormuz. So if a government isn't willing to see this through from when it starts to a successful conclusion, as Trump appears not to be, it argues he never should have started in the first place.
Have you considered the possibility of how deeply entrenched theocratic institutions have been in Iran for the last 47 years? That even if the so-called regime change happens, it will be very difficult to get rid of these shadows across the country.
Well, I think the Revolutionary Guard and its big components, the Quds Force and the Besieged Militia, really are, in effect, the government of Iran now. And I think the Ayatollah's influence is actually quite limited. I think they're more ideological cover for the Revolutionary Guard than anything else. And I think, notwithstanding that the IRGC controls 40% of the economy in many estimates, once you break their military power, then I think their ability to hang on is really very limited. And I think the overwhelming sentiment inside Iran, except for government functionaries, is that the regime needs to go. They're a weaponless population, with the exception of some of the ethnic groups like the Kurds and the Baluchis, that need help from the outside. So I just repeat what I said before. Trump should have been, the U.S. as a whole for many years, but certainly Trump, before launching military action, should have been closely coordinated with the opponents and helping them out. We have no evidence he did either one.
Just last couple of questions. One is, of course, put yourself in Iranian shoes, not necessarily reasonable, but an Iranian person's shoes. He or she looks around and sees three immediate nuclear powers, Pakistan, India, and Israel. They may turn around and say, why can't we have it?
Well, some may say that, but I think the lesson should be you are safer without a nuclear weapon rather than to have a regime that's pursuing it as the Ayatollahs have been. Israel's had nuclear weapons. They still don't acknowledge it, but the world knows they've had nuclear weapons for 5-6 decades already and never used them. They've never had to. India and Pakistan certainly do have nuclear weapons, and it's a significant issue that we've got to confront. But they are also kind of a closed system. This is really, they don't have aspirations to use nuclear weapons outside of attacking each other, at least as far as I know. That doesn't diminish the problem, but it's not a threat. The Pakistani-India nuclear question is not a threat to Iran or the Middle East as a whole.
And finally, what do you think is the political downside, if at all, any, for President Trump because of the war? I mean, do you think the MAGA base is thoroughly disenchanted? It doesn't seem like that.
Well, I think it is a significant problem for him nationwide because of the effect on the economy. And that's, as people say, they vote with their pocketbooks, and that could be threatening higher gas prices and what that means across the board. And by Trump never explaining this to the American people, he's left himself vulnerable. I think the split within the MAGA base is still hard to read. I think the leaders of people who think they're the leaders of MAGA are much more opposed to the war than the base. Many of these people will accept what Trump says, but the isolationist wing, which does exist, I think is thoroughly disenchanted with him. And the question is whether anybody pays any attention to them or not.